discrimination and oppression in all areas. And I think this is important, and particularly to be having a conversation or invitation from Hit the Gas, also critically important, and they overlap in many ways. We have a very simplistic understanding, an awful job of explaining gender. They don't look at the history. They try to retell the story from a present day lens to make it sound better than what it was, and the evolution of gender and what groups were afforded the ability to have gender wasn't seen as a gender group at all for most of our history in this country. Gender was something that you evolved to. So even our President Thomas Jefferson did not see African Americans or Africans in this country as a group who was a gendered group. He saw us somewhere between the orangutan and human beings. He said in his notes on the state of Virginia that as an orangutan tries to raise its species up by having sex with an African woman, just the same thing happens with a Black man in this country who tries to mate with a white woman to raise its species up to a human being level. So we really don't have that because we try to gloss over our history. I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how we get to this conceptualization of Ahmaud Arbery and even George Floyd. But you see this picture that I have here. It's lynchings in a tree. And it's actually it's a baobab tree from Africa. But the real images are those black bodies, those silhouettes of those black bodies. They call this strange fruit. And there was a song that Billie Holiday sang. It was from a poem that said, "Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in a southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, pastoral scenes of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent in magnolias sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here's a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop, and bitter crop." Now, that song was getting at the essence of what would happen to enslaved Black people and how easy it was to send a message to lynch Black bodies. Now, the overwhelming majority of the lynches that occurred were against Black men. And it was to send a message to the rest of the plantation about, if you try to rise up, if you try to revolt, if you try to resist against white supremacy, we will kill you. So we don't really have a true understanding of the brutality of the enslavement process, because we want to give our children in K through 12 a kind of soft examination of enslavement. And until we really deal with the actual history of enslavement, we won't know how the intergenerational trauma is passed on and why you see things like what's happening in Minneapolis right now. So let's look at this. It's really kind of hard for many of our white brothers and sisters to recognize what Black people are going through. So this slide here says the majority of Blacks say they face discrimination. Those, your picture is on the slide. Let me move you. But those with college experiences are more likely to say this. So you see here where more Black people with college or more are saying that they experience racism and discrimination than, say, high school or the overall Black population, right? So why is that? We have to start to ask ourselves questions, because again, we come to the study of race and racism too simplistic. We think that, well, somebody with a high school diploma or less in, say, the urban community of a city like my hometown of Chicago might be going through much more racism than, say, somebody in Salt Lake City who's African American. And that just does not bear out from the data. And this is across the country where we're seeing people with Black people with college degrees oftentimes confronting much more overt racism. So why is that? A couple of questions. And since we're online and we're not in like a classroom or setting, I can't really engage you. I'm only seeing Peter right now, but but some of the reasons that this is explained is because when most of us get college degrees, we take jobs that are consistent with our educational training. Where are those jobs? Those jobs aren't on the south side of Chicago. Those jobs aren't in Black communities in Detroit. They're in Salt Lake City. So what is the experience like then for Black people who are in Salt Lake City, who have college degrees, who have a certain type of expectation of, well, they told me to do everything right, to stay clean, to get a good education, to work hard, you'll get upward mobility, you will be able to buy a home. But what we find is Blacks with college degrees are disproportionately reporting discrimination and racism. Uh-oh. There we go. Let me go back. So then when we ask, do you agree or disagree with these days police in most cities treat Blacks as fairly as they treat whites? You can see based upon the different racial groups and political leanings that there's variance across the board. So Black people in general, and this is a Huffington Post survey, 76% say they disagree with that statement. But when you ask that to whites, 31% say they disagree. When you ask that to Democrats overall, 65%. So that's still a significant difference from the way Black people feel about their treatment in society in most cities. And then you see it continuously lowers with independents and Republicans. So what we see here is a mismatch in the experiences that Black people are saying that they're having from what other groups believe they're having. Now, if I tell you that I feel discriminated and you are supposed to be my ally, and despite the overwhelming evidence, you say, I don't believe you, that's problematic. And you can then start to see why it's taken so long for us to make progress in this society. So let's start to transition a little bit into these experiences with police. The rates of police stops versus Black men, since we're talking about Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and so many others as has been stated already. Just in the last week, we've been seeing case after case after case after case, and some of these have been on videos, and videos elicit a different kind of experience. So with our sister who got shot and killed from the police breaking into her house, we didn't have video evidence of that, despite the fact that Cincinnati Blacks are demonstrating there. When you see what happened to George Floyd or a Ahmaud Arbery, just the video evidence alone elicits a psychological and emotional response from you. But look at it. This is New York data and the rate of police stops. So you can see across the age groups, that's the age groups at the bottom, and the number of stops per age groups and what the impact is on Black men versus all other groups. So if I were to ask a white woman, Is there a problem with police stopping people for no reason? Based on this data, she might say no. And then if you ask her uh, about the experiences of white women, she would say, oh, there's no problem. If we get stopped because we did something wrong, but we rarely do anything wrong. So what this somebody who wants to maintain a level of blindness might say, well, black men give you more reason to be stopped. They're doing more crimes, and that just does not fit the evidence, right? Because most of these men were released either with nothing found on them. It was usually the stops are to look for drugs or guns, and then they're released. So almost every other group is not having, well, no group here, based on this data, is having the same experience as black men. So what we have to do is try to get outside of our own reality to see what walking in the footsteps of black people in general, but black men in particular, since that's the focus of our conversation, to understand their reality. And too often we don't do that. We'll stay in our own bubble, our own racial, sexualized, gendered, class-based bubble, and say, well, this is my experience. So my experience must be the same for everybody else. And most people, but disproportionately white citizens, want to believe that our society is fair. Right? The fortunate thing is for those people who are members and represent the LGBTQ community, we will get, who are white, we will get an increased belief that discrimination and racism exist. However, and I'm sure you all know, the data also suggests that there's racism and anti-blackness within that community as well that has to be dealt with. So let's just look quickly at some of the findings from these reports. So we know that across the US, black residents were more likely to be stopped by the police than white or Hispanic, Latinx residents, both in traffic stops and street stops. Nearly 1 million US residents aged 16 or older experienced the threat or use of force by police in 2015. It's actually increased by 2019. In 2010, near the park of the city's use of near the peak of the city, and this is New York City, use of stop and frisk, black residents in New York City were 8 times more likely to be stopped by the police than white residents. Now, what is this similar to? Unfortunately, again, we don't have a classroom where I can just easily engage you, but if you saw what the New York City Police Department were doing with social or physical distancing in the parks or on the streets, we saw police officers handing out masks and, or asking white residents to make sure they maintain social distancing. However, just a few blocks down, we saw them violently throwing black and brown bodies to the ground, pushing people's heads in the cement who weren't socially distancing. So there's a different experience that's going on across the country in all major cities that maybe sometimes whites who could be potentially allies do not see and don't investigate because their own worldview suggests something else. However, black and brown people are saying, no, this is natural. This is an everyday experience for us. And then they don't want to look at the data. So here we see in 2011, New York City police reported using force in 23% of stops of black and Latino residents, but in only 16% of stops of white residents. Now, to show you how this happens and the implicit biases, implicit racism, and stereotypes that are embedded in white minds and ideologies. And actually, we've all suffered from the same type of socialization. So one might be Latinx and hold these same beliefs. One might actually be Black and hold these same beliefs about Black people because of the socialization that we've had. We all have been victims of white supremacy and white racism, right? So we have to clearly understand that. So how is it that a Black man at 5'4", 5 feet 4 inches, the police stop him 4.5 times more often than a white man of the same height? At 5'10", police stop 5.3 Black men for every white man. And I'm 6'3", so just an inch shorter than this next one. But at 6'4", police stop 6.2 Black men for every white man. I have been here going on 21 years. My first semester here at the University of Utah, I was stopped by the police twice in one semester, not doing anything, just trying to make a legal turn at a stop sign. And the police, well, actually, I'm sorry, let me correct myself. They didn't stop me on that turn. They prevented me from turning. Right? So they would not let me turn in the intersection. Every time I tried to turn, they would inch up into the intersection to block me. And then they passed me, looking at me with like this angry look. So first semester here, and that's my experience. And then I had a colleague who I was taking home, a professor, white woman. We went to the same graduate program at the University of Illinois, and she had on a hoodie. So she believes that they couldn't tell that she was a white woman. And she's an anti-racist, white feminist activist. I couldn't remember if she had the hoodie on or not. But they followed us until I got to her house, and I was trying to, I told her about a mile into the pursuit, because they just trailed us, she didn't know. I said, the police are following us. And I said that as I moved over to park in front of her house, and she thought that she could use her whiteness to diffuse the situation, and she jumped out the car. And the police, one police officer on her side had his gun, his hand on the gun. The police on my side had his gun unholstered. And they asked her, ma'am, is there a problem? And she said, no, he's dropping me off at home. And they asked 3 times. And then she said, what is the problem, officers? And they said to her, he parked a little far from the curb, right? So she's panicking. She asked me if I'm going to be all right. And I said, yes, but they followed me all the way. And she lives right by the Capitol. They followed me all the way up. I turned right. The Capitol was on my left. And if you know anything about Salt Lake City, downtown, the LDS convention, whatever it's called, down at whatever it's called. Somebody knows on here. I see Peter knows. That they followed me all the way down there from the Capitol all the way before they did a U-turn. All right. Welcome to Salt Lake City. All right. So with this, what we see, there's a belief about this Black male body. This is where gender is so important, and what our research and our study is so inadequate that they believe that Black males, because they are male or man, have privilege based on patriarchy. That's not how white capitalistic elite patriarchy works. Black males, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but is a subgroup that needs to be controlled. Just like LGBTQ members need to be controlled, just like certain class group members need to be controlled. And we have to start asking sophisticated questions to understand why all of us have become desensitized with the death and dying of black men. So that one can happen. We get upset when we see it on a video, but then a week later we go on about our business. But if you remember, some of you might be too young, but there was a whale, I think it was called Willie, that a movie was made after it called Free Willy, where everybody was so concerned about this whale in the Pacific Ocean that they did everything possible to save it so it wouldn't die. The same thing we would do. Think about the woman in, I guess it was in Central Park, New York, who tried to say that the black man was threatening her. Now, she was a liberal. She was a Democrat. That was her voting record that got released illegally, probably. But so she knew by calling the police that she could have this man killed, right? The Humane Society for the Animals took the dog away immediately for what they saw on the film. And yet we can't even get justice that quick for people who, for black men who are laying there dying with somebody's knee in their neck, or somebody who's out for a jog and it takes 2 months or more before it even is brought up for investigation. But this slide here shows you that there's this thing about competence and threat. And white men who are taller are seen to have more competence, who are seen to be wiser, smarter, and more able to lead. However, for black men, that straight black line shows you that for black men, the taller they get, the more threatening they are. Okay? And so this is just a slide here to show you some of the discrimination that exists in law enforcement, when they map police, that we see that 300 black men on average, well, actually between 250 to 300, 300 is usually the high average of black men who are murdered every year by the police. And usually about 24 to 25% of them are unarmed. Black women, their numbers are between 10 and 15 a year that are killed by the police, typically unarmed. So what we've noticed since 2017, and especially by 2019 fall semester, that there's been a dramatic increase in racial hate crimes across the country, but more specifically on college campuses. And I'm sure you all have seen some of those things that have occurred on Salt Lake Community College for the last couple of years. This slide here shows us how black men are, there's something on top of the screen so I can't see it, but they're reporting treatment, unfair treatment in higher numbers from the police than even their female counterparts. So while black women are being discriminated, oppressed, violated by the police, black men in most cases are viewing that and experiencing that in higher levels. So there's this thing about controlling the black body, and particularly controlling the black male body that has existed since enslavement in this country. And so that's where gender becomes very, very important, because what happens is black men have not evolved in our research to be seen as a gendered group. So we don't understand anti-black misandry like I write about. So it's this hatred towards black men that we must control their body, that we can make sure that they go in disproportionate numbers to special ed, to be arrested, to be unemployed, to have the lowest healthcare treatment. So all of these discriminatory factors, black men tend to be at the very bottom. So patriarchy does not benefit them. If they do, they're the worst patriarchs in society, right? So we must start to ask ourselves better questions. To get towards the why we treat black men where we can just kneel on his neck for 9+ minutes to kill him, acting like we're not doing anything with our hands in our pocket. We must reevaluate our history and how we got here. So Bullwhip Days, The Slave Remember, is an excellent book to begin to hear what the testimonies. So these are white researchers who went south to interview former slaves, enslaved people, to get their oral history, to see from their own mouths the brutality of the enslavement process. And if you just read a little bit, don't eat before you read the book or read these quotes. It might make you sick. But that is the way we start to understand the legacy of white supremacy in this country and its impact on everybody. So psychologically and emotionally on blacks, but also psychologically and emotionally on whites, because who has had a healing process from this experience? Nobody. Joe Fagan is an anti-racist white scholar, sociologist who wrote the book Racist America. He also wrote How Blacks Built America. Excellent reading, so you can see what the roots and the current realities of a racist America is in the treatment of black people. Then we must also come to grips with they were her property. So this is written by a black woman historian who talked about how white women benefited from the enslavement system. Patriarchy has protected her from investigation because they made her appear to be innocent. But that was not true. And in this book shows that when a father died, typically his sons would inherit the land and the daughters would inherit the enslaved people. Both are property, both are valuable, both continues wealth. So they were her property helps us to start to understand this lengthy history. How Blacks Built America shows the contributions of black people in America, but social dominance theory by Jim Sedanius gives us this trimorphic type of understanding of white patriarchy in this society, and how you have these kind of three groups. You have a racial gender dynamic, and then you have an arbitrary group. And an arbitrary group could be members of the LGBTQ community and how they are oppressed. It could be class. It could be black men as a subgroup of that. And his argument is from historical, national, and global data is that the dominant group has to oppress, even to use of death, the subordinate male groups, right? So this is a very good reading to get a better understanding of a more complicated structure in our society that allows for Ahmaud Arbery and a George Floyd to continue to be treated the way they've been treated in 2020. And then The Man Not by Tommy J. Curry is excellent to understand homoerotic racism and how white women even raped black men during the enslavement process all the way through to the 1960s by being forced to penetrate. And he uses great data to show this. He also touches on the fact of how Jewish men during the Holocaust were raped by the Nazis to be abused psychologically and emotionally, and also to send a message to other Jewish members who were part of the Holocaust. So these 6 books are fundamental to get your reading going. Creation of this big black brute is the byproduct of everything that we've talked about. So we've all seen Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging. Now, we don't know if that was him in the house or not, but let's say it was. I've done that here in Salt Lake City. I have tons of pictures on my phone where because my first, instead of psychology, my first interest was in architecture. So I would go by new builds, take pictures as they're being developed to see the growth of them. All of us do it. Peter's raising his hand. All of us do it, right? But they try to make him fit the stereotype of this big black brute, this threat, this person that is worthy to die, to get the focus off of the killers, but onto him as if he was deserving. So here in the picture on the left, where you see him against his car, you know, when you're treated like that New York data police stop data that I showed you, and you're constantly abused by the police, you're constantly abused by society, you get frustrated, you get racial battle fatigue, you get you have night terrors, you psychologically, emotionally, and behaviorally, you just struggle just to maintain your health. So he's frustrated, but people see that video because they put it out intentionally to say he's a thug. Look at him getting agitated. He deserves to die. Look what he did in high school. Look what he did before that, trying to justify his death. And then we have George Floyd. And you see this police officer with his knee on his neck for 9+ minutes. He had his hands in his pocket as if he's really not doing much. I'm just holding him down, but he knows that he's killing him. What happens in an untreated white mind? And I'm talking about untreated all the way from the history of enslavement and all of the messages that we've gotten over the years about the value of Black life when you can do this. And just recently we saw a video of police officers beating up a Black grandmother, right? Punching her in the face because psychologically, you cannot see them as human. So you're still in the same mindset as Thomas Jefferson, that they're not fully human. They're not even at the level of a dog, a pet, who's treated much better. And so this picture on the bottom left, while blurry, there's 3 officers with their knees on him. 3. And 1 blocking who's standing. So this gets us to where we are today to try to understand the psychological game that is being played with Black bodies. And we have to have, as I said, a better conversation, better research to understand how gender and race intersect. Not this typical intersectionality that we talk about in our ways in which we think one group has to be above another, but really, what are the life consequences of people, of marginalized populations in our country? Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I was like, can you send me the slides to that, and then I can pass them forward to those that are interested. The content that you shared with us is just incredible. So thank you for coming and sharing that with us today. Black Student Union, do you have anything that you would like to add to the conversation, or any other comments?
I would just like to thank Dr. Smith for coming today, especially because I know he's got to be busy and, you know, everything's crazy right now. So you taking the time to put that all together, we all really appreciate that.
Thank you. You all see my Black, I'm representing out here, right?
I see what school you're representing. You're representing the University of Utah. And
send me a shirt. Send me a shirt and I'll wear that.
You're only allowed to wear University of Utah shirts, Dr. Smith.
Right. My wife, who's a vice president at the U, said graduate so we can get you all to the University of Utah. We want to see you here. We need you as leaders here on this campus too.
And we've got some incredible student leaders at Salt Lake Community College, so you'll be lucky to have them when they transfer up there for sure. Well, Baringo, sorry.
Oh, okay. So like I just wanted to like sum up everything, like everything Dr. Smith said. Like even though we couldn't have like the in classroom conversation where we'd be like snapping back like the movie also did relate, and thank you, Peter, because that was like a good summation of, you know, what all our topics were this discussion. And 1 hour sometimes isn't enough to talk about everything we gotta say off our chest, because this months have really been getting into my emotions, my feelings, like. But yeah, I'm happy we're having this discussion, and I pray it doesn't end here, that we could do more. This is just the start of it. I mean, discussions have been hard before, but with us, this is really just the start. So thank you all again.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep you all too long. I had a poll for next week's film, which it's not pulling up for some reason. It was working earlier and now it's disappeared. And so I'll go off of last week's votes, but I do hope that this conversation continues, that this conversation won't end until anti-Black racism has ended, until the fight is over, that we continue to have these conversations, that we continue to fight for justice, that we continue to push for liberation and equity, right? And so I appreciate you all for coming and being a part of this conversation, and hopefully we can continue to push the dial forward, push the movement forward, and create some real positive changes for everybody, right? Especially for Black men in America and around the world. So with that, I would like to invite everybody. Sharif, I see you. 1 second. I want to invite everybody. This is a weekly conversation. We pick a new film every week. We've had some incredible conversations. For those that have been a part of them throughout the beginning, hopefully you can also testify that these conversations are really beneficial, unpacking all kinds of things like sexism, like immigration, all of these things. And so this happens every Friday at noon. We post the film of the week on our social media, on Instagram and Facebook, which is at SLCC GSSRC, lots of acronyms there, but feel free to hop on and join us for these conversations each week. Before I wrap up, Sharifa, you had wanted to say something, right? Sharifa, didn't you raise your hand?
No, yeah, sorry. I was just asking would it be possible for us to stay a little bit over until like 1:30 to discuss the film, or do we gotta wrap it up? Well, you're on mute, sorry.
You're right, sorry. I'll also end the recording here.